Before seatbelt laws, before smoking bans, before the internet tracked every move, you could live your life without a dozen rules standing in the way. In the 1980s, America still felt like a big backyard, where neighbors looked out for each other and the world felt wide open. Streets were familiar, shopkeepers remembered your name, and the air seemed lighter not because times were perfect, but because there was room to breathe. In small towns and quiet suburbs, life moved at a comfortable pace. Kids pedaled their bikes in loose packs, weaving between driveways and open fields, their laughter carrying over the hum of lawnmowers. Parents didn't hover. They knew someone, maybe a neighbor or a friend's mom, would keep an eye out. A scraped knee or a flat tire was just part of the day, not a crisis requiring an emergency plan. Local businesses were the heartbeat of these communities. The corner grocery, the hardware store, the video rental shop didn't just sell goods. They traded in conversation. The owner knew which movie you rented last time and might set aside your favorite snack for you. The schoolyard, the church parking lot, and the diner counter doubled as meeting places, where news traveled by word of mouth long before it hit the paper. Paperwork was rare. If you wanted to start a weekend yard sale, you just put a sign on the corner and opened your garage door. Kids could run a lemonade stand without a permit, and no one would come by to shut it down. Safety warnings were minimal. A rusty swing set was more likely to get fixed with a quick weld than replaced by a regulation-approved model. There was an unspoken understanding that people were responsible for themselves. Communities handled small problems on their own. If a kid broke a neighbor's window with a baseball, it was handled with apologies and a handshake, not a formal complaint. Rules existed, but they felt like guidelines rather than constant barriers, and the trust between people filled in the spaces where regulations didn't reach. The soundtrack of those years still lingers in memory: radios playing in open garages, the chime of a cash register, the metallic click of a bicycle freewheel. It was a time when freedom wasn't a political talking point. It was woven into everyday routines. But even as the 80s rolled on, small changes began to appear. New rules, new signs, and new ways of thinking slowly reshaped those wide-open spaces. Most people didn't notice it at first, but the balance between trust and control was shifting. But as the decades rolled on, the balance between trust and control began to shift, starting with the way we moved around. Seatbelts optional. Kids sprawled in the back of station wagons. Riding in a truck bed on the highway wasn't just legal, it was part of growing up. In the 1980s, the family car was less a secured transport vehicle and more an extension of the living room. Long road trips meant kids lying on blankets in the back, playing card games, or pressing their noses to the glass to watch the scenery fly by. Nobody counted seatbelts, and nobody thought twice about it. Child restraint laws existed in some places, but they were loosely enforced. Booster seats were rare, and many parents simply buckled kids in with whatever belts were available if they buckled them at all. In station wagons, the coveted way-back seat faced the row behind, a spot where kids waved at drivers or made faces at strangers, a harmless thrill that's now against safety regulations. The pickup truck bed was its own adventure. On summer evenings, it was common to see teenagers standing against the cab, hair whipping in the wind as they rode toward a ball game, the lake, or a Friday night hangout. Dogs often rode back there too, tongues out, tails wagging. The open road didn't just mean mobility, it meant fun, and the law didn't interfere. Motorcycle riders, too, enjoyed more choice in how they rode. In many states, helmets were optional for adults, and the sight of a rider with the wind in their face and no headgear was as normal as seeing a convertible with the top down. For many, it was about the feeling of freedom in its purest form, even if it came with obvious risks. Law enforcement's focus was different then. Officers were more concerned with drunk driving, reckless speeds, and serious accidents than with making sure every passenger was buckled in. While safety campaigns existed, they were gentle nudges rather than strict mandates. often appealing to common sense rather than threatening legal consequences. Over time, research, advocacy, and tragedy began to change the public mindset. Studies on crash survival rates, combined with high-profile accidents, pushed states to adopt stricter seatbelt and child restraint laws. Helmet requirements expanded, open container laws tightened, and public safety campaigns shifted from suggestion to enforcement. By the 1990s, what had been casual choices in the 80s became legal obligations, with fines attached. For those who lived it, the memory of a summer ride in the back of a pickup, feeling every bump in the road and watching the sun dip below the horizon, remains vivid. It was a simple, joyful part of growing up that today exists mostly in old photos and faded stories. And the lack of rules didn't end on the road, it carried right into our parks, lakes, and neighborhoods. From bonfires at the beach to camping in public parks without permits, the outdoors belonged to everyone in the 80s. Public spaces were truly public, open, accessible, and shaped more by tradition than by policy. A park was a place to gather, not a list of rules posted on a metal sign. Many parks stayed open late, some even around the clock. On warm summer nights, families spread blankets under the stars, the smell of charcoal drifting from a nearby grill. Friends gathered at picnic tables for card games and music, sometimes staying well past midnight without worrying about a ranger asking them to leave. The idea of closing hours for a park seemed unnecessary. Why is the fence something meant to be shared? Bonfires were a staple of social life. On beaches, in campgrounds, and even in empty lots, people built fires from driftwood or scrap lumber, pulling up lawn chairs and swapping stories into the night. Permits weren't required, and few people thought about regulations. The unspoken rule was simple: enjoy it, be safe, and clean up when you're done. Swimming followed the same spirit. Lakes, rivers, and neighborhood ponds were open to anyone brave enough to jump in. Lifeguards were rare outside of public pools, and the absence of posted warnings didn't discourage anyone. Kids learned to swim from parents, older siblings, or just by wading in and figuring it out. Fishing and hunting were often casual affairs. In many rural areas, licenses were more of a formality than an enforced requirement. People kept rods in their car trunks and could decide on a whim to cast a line before heading home from work. Hunters followed the seasons, but much of the enforcement came from community knowledge rather than official patrols. Safety came from the people using these spaces, not from a constant layer of oversight. If someone got hurt, friends stepped in first. If a storm rolled in, folks packed up on their own. There was a shared understanding that public areas worked best when everyone respected them. Today, those same spaces are dotted with fences, locked gates, and signs warning of rules and penalties. Bonfires require permits, swimming is restricted to designated areas, and parks close at set times. While the modern approach brings more organization and safety, it also removes the easy, unplanned experiences that defined the outdoors for so many in the 80s. For those who remember it, the outdoors then felt like a bigger, freer extension of home with no reservations, no paperwork, and no one checking the clock. But if you really wanted to see freedom in action, you just had to watch how kids spent their days. Leave in the morning, come back at dinner, no calls, no check-ins, no panic. Childhood in the 80s came with real independence. The world outside your front door was an open playground, and the rules were few. Parents expected you to use common sense, and kids learned quickly that freedom came with the responsibility to get yourself home in one piece. Walking to school alone was part of growing up. First graders strolled down sidewalks in small groups, backpacks bouncing, talking about cartoons or trading baseball cards along the way. Crossing guards might help at busy intersections, but for the most part, kids managed their own routes. There were no debates about whether it was safe. It was simply normal. Bikes were the great equalizer. giving every kid the power to roam far beyond their own block. No helmets, no reflective vests, just a set of wheels and enough quarters for a soda at the convenience store. Friends met at parks, creeks, or the arcade without a single text message exchanged. The plan was always simple: be home when the streetlights came on. Hitchhiking, while already starting to decline, still carried a sense of adventure in some communities. Teens might catch a ride to the next town for a concert, or to the lake on a hot afternoon. Strangers stopping to offer lifts wasn't instantly seen as dangerous. It was often viewed as a neighborly gesture. Play happened anywhere space allowed. Empty lots became football fields. Woods turned into kingdoms. Half-built houses doubled as fortresses for games of hide and seek. Construction sites, junkyards, and railroad tracks were fair game for exploration. Danger was acknowledged, but rarely fenced off. If you got a splinter or a cut, you cleaned it and moved on. Fear existed, but it didn't dictate daily life. Parents were aware of accidents and rare crimes, but the news didn't cycle endlessly, replaying worst-case scenarios. Without constant reminders of danger, independence felt safer, and kids grew up with skills and confidence shaped by that freedom. That world began to change in the late 80s and early 90s. High-profile crime cases, heavily covered by national news, started to shift public perception. New safety campaigns and legal standards encouraged closer supervision, curfews, and organized activities over unsupervised exploration. The idea of letting a child wander the neighborhood without an adult became controversial and, in some places, even subject to legal scrutiny. For those who came of age in the 80s, the memory of entire days spent out in the world, navigating by instinct, solving problems on the fly, and learning to trust their own judgment, remains one of the defining experiences of the era. And that same casual trust extended to another part of life that's now tightly controlled: alcohol. Beer in the passenger seat, wine at the park. In the 80s, alcohol wasn't hidden. It was part of the scenery. It wasn't too unusual to see a cooler riding shotgun on a summer road trip, or a couple sharing a bottle of wine on a picnic blanket in the middle of a public park. Drinking wasn't necessarily about excess. It was simply more visible, more casual, and more accepted than it is today. In many states, the legal drinking age was still 18 well into the mid-80s. College towns thrived on this, with bars and live music venues packed with customers barely out of high school. Crossing state lines could mean an entirely different set of rules, and young people often knew exactly which counties or towns had the most relaxed policies. Open container laws were far looser. Passengers could drink openly in a moving car in some states, and tailgating wasn't just for stadium parking lots. It was a standard part of community events. At parades, county fairs, and even some school fundraisers, beer booths were set up alongside food stalls, and no one worried about separating family spaces from drinking spaces. In rural areas, public intoxication was handled more informally. A man stumbling home from the local bar might be escorted by a friend rather than approached by police. Officers often knew everyone in town and treated minor overindulgence as a private matter unless it became a real disturbance. The shift away from this open culture was gradual at first. Rising awareness of drunk driving fatalities, combined with national advocacy campaigns, pushed lawmakers toward change. In 1984, Congress passed legislation pressuring states to raise the legal drinking age to 21, a move that was fully in place nationwide by 1988. Around the same time, open container laws tightened, DUI penalties increased, and public campaigns painted drinking and driving as a deadly gamble. By the 1990s, the casual presence of alcohol in everyday public spaces had all but disappeared. What had once been a normal part of community life was now restricted to designated venues and tightly controlled situations. For those who lived through it, the idea of sipping a beer in the passenger seat or walking through a fair with a drink in hand now feels like something out of another world. The 80s approach to alcohol reflected a broader cultural attitude of trust and personal responsibility, a belief that adults could make their own choices without constant oversight. Whether that trust was always deserved is another story, but it was a defining part of the era's rhythm of life. But alcohol wasn't the only thing people could access easily back then. Firearms and fireworks were just as within reach. In the 80s, a teenager could buy a rifle at the hardware store or light fireworks in the street without raising an eyebrow. Firearms in many communities were treated as ordinary tools, something you might own for hunting, target practice, or protection, but not something that required layers of paperwork. If you had the cash, the sale was quick, and you could walk out the door with your purchase the same day. In rural towns, it wasn't uncommon to see kids as young as 12 carrying 22 rifles down dirt roads, heading to a field for an afternoon of shooting tin cans. Gun safety was usually taught at home, passed down from parents or grandparents rather than through official classes. Responsibility was assumed, and trust in young people's ability to handle firearms was a cultural norm. Fireworks were just as accessible. In the weeks before the 4th of July, roadside stands and small shops sold everything from sparklers to powerful bottle rockets. Kids bought them with their allowance and set them off in driveways, parks, and open lots. The sound of firecrackers popping in neighborhoods during summer evenings was part of the season's soundtrack. For the more daring, homemade explosives were seen as a sort of backyard science project. Combining ingredients from household supplies or repurposing leftover fireworks wasn't viewed as criminal. It was a mix of curiosity, fun, and, admittedly, a little recklessness. Injuries happened, but they were generally treated as the unfortunate result of kids being kids, rather than as legal violations. By the late 80s, safety campaigns began to grow louder. Public service announcements warned about the dangers of unsecured firearms and the hazards of fireworks. Tragic accidents made headlines, prompting new conversations about regulations. Slowly, laws tightened. Age restrictions for gun purchases became more strictly enforced. Background checks started to appear, target practice, and fireworks faced increasing bans in residential areas. Layers of paperwork. Today, the contrast is stark. Buying a gun now involves permits, ID checks, and in many states, in rural towns, it wasn't uncommon. Fireworks are heavily restricted in numerous communities, with fines for unauthorized use. What once might have been dismissed as a harmless summer tradition could now result in confiscation or even arrest. For those who lived through it, the memory of those summer nights, the smell of gunpowder in the air, the crack of a rifle in the distance, the laughter around a backyard fire remains vivid. It was an era when personal freedom was weighed more heavily than regulation, and when trust was given first, not earned through compliance. Even money itself worked differently in the 80s. Cash ruled, and nobody was asking for your ID. No ID? No problem. In the 80s, you could pay for almost anything in cash and leave no paper trail. Money moved hand to hand, and transactions were quick, personal, and often undocumented. If you had the bills in your pocket, that was all the proof you needed. Cash wasn't just for small buys. Rent was handed over in envelopes at the kitchen table, maybe with a quick receipt scribbled on a scrap of paper if one was given at all. Used cars were bought with thick stacks of 20s, often sealed with nothing more than a handshake. Even bigger deals, like buying land or equipment, could be done entirely in cash. No bank transfer or ID verification required. ID checks were rare for purchases outside of alcohol or tobacco. You could walk into an electronics store, drop a few $100s on a new TV, and walk out without anyone knowing your name. Privacy was built into the way money worked, not because people were hiding something, but because there was no system designed to track every transaction. Travel was just as easygoing. Before TISA security and mandatory ID checks, You could buy a plane or bus ticket with cash and board without a second glance. Airports were open spaces where you could meet someone right at their gate, carry a bottle of soda onto the plane, and pass through security in minutes. Nobody cared whether your name matched a boarding pass, because boarding passes weren't tied to databases, and no one was scanning your ID at the counter. Renting a motel room was equally simple. Walk in, pay cash, get a key. No credit card imprint, no copy of your driver's license. In some places, the only record of your stay was the name you wrote in the guest log, if you even bothered to write your real one. This system worked on trust. Sellers trusted buyers to keep their word, and buyers trusted sellers to deliver what they promised. Disputes happened, of course, but they were handled face-to-face, often without lawyers or official complaints. The shift began slowly in the late 80s and accelerated through the 90s. Credit cards became more common. Electronic payment systems spread, and regulations to combat fraud and money laundering began to standardize ID checks. By the early 2000s, digital commerce and post-9/11 security measures had nearly erased the anonymity that once came with cash. Today, paying for a car or a vacation entirely in cash raises eyebrows and often triggers extra questions. Transactions leave digital fingerprints, and privacy in spending is far harder to protect. For those who remember, the 80s were the last decade when money felt truly untraceable, when you could travel, shop, and live without a single electronic record following you. And in everyday life, there were habits so normal then that they get you fined or worse today. Smoking in a hospital, tossing trash in a burn barrel, letting your dog run free. The 80s had its own rule book, and it was short. Back then, the sight of someone lighting up in a waiting room didn't turn heads. Ashtrays sat on restaurant tables, office desks, and even next to vending machines in public buildings. If you didn't smoke, you just learned to live with it. The air was a haze of cigarette smoke in diners, bowling alleys, and airports, and no one thought much of it. Environmental laws were equally outside of alcohol. In many neighborhoods, people burned their garbage in metal barrels behind the house, sending smoke into the air without a second thought. Leaves, cardboard, and even household trash went up in flames every fall. In rural areas, dumping an old appliance in a gully or tossing used motor oil on a backlot wasn't a shocking act. It was how things were done. Dogs roamed the streets like they owned them. It was normal to see a neighborhood mutt trotting from one yard to another, stopping for a snack before heading home. There were no leash laws in many towns, and animal control usually stepped in only if a dog was aggressive. Pets lived part of their lives on their own terms, exploring the world without a human holding the other end of the leash. Zoning rules were looser, especially outside big cities. People built sheds, ran small businesses from their garages, and parked multiple cars in the yard without worrying about fines. Independence early. Property was yours to use as you saw fit, face to face, and as long as it didn't cause real harm to others, most neighbors didn't complain. The changes came slowly but steadily. By the 90s, indoor smoking bans spread from hospitals to restaurants to nearly every public building. Environmental campaigns pushed for recycling, proper waste disposal, and cleaner air. Leash laws became standard in cities and towns, and zoning codes tightened to maintain property values and community appearance. Health and safety became guiding principles, replacing the looser, live and let live approach of the past. While these changes made spaces cleaner, safer, and in many ways healthier, they also chipped away at the casual, unregulated character of everyday life in the 80s. For those who remember, there's still a certain fondness for a time when the rules were fewer, the boundaries were softer, and people were trusted to make their own choices, even if those choices weren't always wise. But looking back, those freedoms are flawed as they still hold lessons for today. The 80s weren't perfect, but they gave Americans a taste of freedom that is hard to find now. It was a time when the day felt yours to shape, when the rules that guided life were more about common sense and neighborly respect and printed signs or legal codes. The air of the decade carried a looseness, an easy trust, and the belief that most people could be counted on to do the right thing without being told exactly how. That freedom came with risks. There were accidents on the road, injuries on playgrounds, and choices that ended badly. But the rewards were real too. Children learned independence early. Communities solved problems face to face. People lived without the constant sense that every decision might be monitored, recorded, or judged. The trade-off was accepted because the benefits of self-reliance, trust, and a sense of ownership over one's life were worth it. By the nostalgia for that era is more than longing for the past. Public it's an acknowledgement of how those freedoms shaped the people who grew up with them. And the hazards of riding in the back of a pickup truck, camping without a permit, paying cash for a road trip wasn't about breaking rules, because the rules were different. Those experiences are etched into memory as moments of connection, discovery, and joy. But freedom was never meant to be the absence of responsibility. In the 80s, the two went hand in hand. You looked out for your friends. You kept your promises. You handled the risks because you knew they came with the territory. That balance made the freedoms possible, and it's the part worth carrying forward. Today, many of those liberties are gone, replaced by a more structured, safety-first approach to daily life. Some changes have made the world better, healthier, safer, and more orderly. But in trading away so much of the casual, unregulated way of living, we've also lost some of the confidence and trust that once defined communities. Remembering the 80s isn't about wanting every rule rolled back. You looked out for your friends. It is about preserving the spirit that made those freedoms work. The willingness to take responsibility for yourself, to trust your neighbors, and to believe that not everything needs to be controlled. That spirit can exist in today's world if we choose to make space for it. Because in the end, the freedom of the 80s wasn't just about what you could do. It was about knowing you were allowed to live without constant interference. It was about believing you had the right to shape your own day. That's a feeling worth remembering and worth fighting to keep alive in whatever form it can take. Which of these 80s freedoms would you bring back? Let us know in the comments.